It's Wednesday, May 22nd, 2019, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Mike McKean and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, San Francisco police ransacked the home of a freelance reporter who wouldn't give up his sources. Was their behavior an act of overreach? Another presidential pardon has journalists talking why some say Trump's decision to pardon former media mogul Conrad Black smells like rotten eggs. And a scoop for a St. Louis teen beating a presidential candidate at his own game before breakfast and before rushing off to school to take an advanced placement exam. It's kind of a cool story, and we'll talk more about it in a bit. But first, we're going to do something a little uncharacteristic this week, and we're going to lead our show with something a little lighter. Something I wanted to make sure that we would have plenty of time to talk about, because if we don't, Mike may slay me like the fictional dragon. We're talking about the end of his favorite show and millions of others, Game of Thrones. So tell us, Mike, did it live up to your expectations at the end?
First, I don't know how light a topic this is, Amy. It's very, very important. But
well, it is. It's just not as important as police ransacking a reporter's
Probably
home.
not. I would also say, by the way, spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, if you haven't been watching the final season or the final episode, or you just don't want to go down this dark hole with me, you probably should turn off your listening or viewing device, because I'm going to talk about some really geeky stuff for a couple of minutes here. But did it meet my expectations? Yes and no. And it really depends on, where you came to this show from. Were you a big fan of the books before the TV show? Did you only watch the TV show? Did you only come on, and watch the last season because everybody was talking about it? You might have different expectations. My expectations were tempered somewhat by the fact that I knew it wasn't going to end the way I would have wanted the books to end, if they ever end, if George R.R. Martin ever finishes the books.
Okay, so Ernest and I, we're not fans, have never watched an episode, at least I haven't. So help catch us up here. Had the series gone further than the books, so it got to a point that was further than what we knew was going to happen?
Yes, the last 2 seasons have gone beyond the books. The author of the books has been an executive producer for the show from the beginning. He allegedly gave the writers an outline of where it was supposed to go, and they have supposedly followed that relatively faithfully. So you can't, as a lot of people are doing, blame it just on the producers of the show for somehow ruining this book. But they had the characteristics of television to worry about, not just books. They had a huge audience. HBO was giving them a lot of money, and so they were expected to produce a spectacle. Lots of CGI, dragons and battles and all kinds of other stuff. But what the show was really based on initially for a lot of super fans was the politics and the machinations and all of the behind-the-scenes works of these different personalities and characters. There weren't all good guys or all bad guys. There were some really bad people who you could sympathize with. And so, no, those folks, like me, were not going to be satisfied entirely by the way it ended. And certainly the folks on social media, certainly the critics who've been following this, because, well, let's just be frank, a lot of traffic to news websites is coming in the past several weeks from Game of Thrones stories, feedback, articles, whatever. So no, we weren't going to be satisfied if it was not living up to all of the political machinations and the characters. And some of the fans were thinking, well, a lot of this didn't make sense. But it was not a bad effort by Hollywood, which had made one of the better television shows in the recent past. And they brought it off with some level of style, in my opinion, in the end.
So some level of style. There were a lot of really, really unhappy viewers, though, so much so that there's like a change.org petition circulating to redo the final season.
And I guess my argument would be that in our social media enhanced era, no way was that show going to satisfy a lot of people. But, there were some very specific plot points that people were not really thrilled with either. For example, why did Bran the Broken, and you don't ask me if you don't know, you don't want to know, but how could the character who became king at the end of this thing, who won the Game of Thrones, so to speak, be the person who won?
You just told us how it ended. Yeah, go ahead.
I told you, spoilers.
No, that's okay. It's all good. It's all good.
I mean,
you
there
just
were
saved me 8 seasons of television.
There were other characters who, expected to have different endings, and they didn't. It kind of seemed like that one of the things about Game of Thrones that people really liked was the fact that they would kill off anyone. And you never knew which major characters were going to die, and that was part of the beauty of the books, too. In the last season, most of the heroes, the main characters, lived, even when they shouldn't have. So that was a fair criticism.
So let me ask you this. Even with all of the different criticisms that we've been hearing, was the end plausible, or was this like the snow globe at the end of St. Elsewhere or the end of Dallas that people have been talking about for decades, or the end of The Sopranos that people have been talking about for decades to come because it was so not satisfying?
It was plausible. There were people in a lot of different camps who wanted to have their character win the Game of Thrones. Bran was probably not the one that most people wanted, but probably the one the author wanted. But I will also say, you know, this is a pretty good deal for HBO, no matter what the critics are saying now, because despite the fact that they, as we're going to talk about in a minute, may lose a few viewers for a while, they used that show to bring up a whole series of prequels that are being written by the same author and the same production team. So there's going to be more Game of Thrones whenever they finally get those shows made for years to come. So let's talk about that for a second, because this does bring to an end one of HBO's most popular ever programs. And, you know, this is something that people said at the end of The Sopranos, too, that it had such a loyal audience, that people were so into it. It was appointment television every week. What would happen to HBO when that show was gone? But that show was also on at the time of The Wire, of Big Love, of Sex and the City, of Deadwood, that there was this whole generation of programming that, like, I believe if I'm remembering correctly, at the time, HBO's tagline was, "It's not Sunday, it's HBO." Like, that was Sunday. And at that time, the only way to access HBO was through a cable or satellite subscription. You needed to have that full-on pay TV experience. Here we are in 2019, in the age of streaming, in the age of a la carte programming. What does this look like for HBO and its subscriber base for products like HBO Now without this anchor program?
Well, I mean, it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be difficult for them because they sort of have a template now. I mean, you know that it's not just the way it was back in the day where you had to be in front of a television set to be able to watch it. You can watch it anywhere. You can watch it anytime. You can stream it. So that, I think, is one of the big differences. The question becomes, how do you take the success that HBO has built on Game of Thrones and build that out into more shows? I mean, Mike talked about the prequels that they're talking about now. Well, at some point, the prequels are going to end too. You've got to have another.
They keep having new Star Wars movies.
You've got to have another show, but that's different. That's different. Okay. I mean, you know, you've got to have something. And the question also becomes, HBO's got to compete with. They've got to compete with Netflix. They have to compete with Hulu. They have to compete with the new Disney streaming service.
Amazon Prime, which is also leading people to get their toilet paper same day without having to go to the store.
Absolutely. So all of the landscape has changed. Yeah. But I think one of the consistencies that HBO has been able to bring to it is the quality of the show and the willingness to put money and quality production behind what they put out. And I think as long as they can continue to do that, they're going to be one of the top distributors out there.
I think it's interesting. There was a study that reported to show that HBO could lose as many as 20% of the subscribers to their digital service, HBO Now, when Game of Thrones ends. That's how I get it. And there's still a lot of programs though in the hopper. They have lots of new shows that people like Westworld. It's coming back. Barry has been phenomenal this season. Silicon Valley, Big Little Lies. They've got a lot of shows that people make appointments to watch. Plus, they've got a new Deadwood movie they're coming out with to sort of with the original cast to come back there. HBO is pretty savvy about how it makes and promotes its programs. And even though they're one of the pricier options of all those streaming services you mentioned, I'd be really surprised if they lose a huge percentage of their audience.
Okay, there was one other tangential Game of Thrones media angle that was thrown into all of this. Streaming services in China they were unable, Tencent Video was unable to stream the finale when it first became available, and people in China say that was part of the trade war.
it very well could have been, because the excuse that Tencent gave when at the last second they didn't air the finale was that there were transmission issues. And of course, HBO denies that there were no transmission issues. But at a time when the U.S. is making it harder for Chinese programs to be recorded and filmed here, and at a time when we're having a big trade war that the president is escalating, I imagine that's a better explanation than most.
Okay. Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a couple of cases in which police have been accused of overreach when it comes to interactions with reporters. The first one is in San Francisco, where city officials are now coming down on that city's police department for a raid on the home of Brian Carmody. Carmody had been reporting on some pretty seedy details in the death of a public defender. They were details he got from a leaked police report. They went into this guy's house with They just rammed the door down and they went nuts, handcuffing him at one point and leaving him in a chair in his own house to watch for 6 hours.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those instances where I think the nature in which he's doing his reporting and who he was reporting on played a role in how they handled the situation. They may have had the law on their side, they had the proper paperwork and all of that, but it shouldn't have taken that kind of force
yeah.
To be able to, to enact what they were there to do. So, I mean, I think they're going to have a problem with, because, I mean, he, to a certain extent, he's going to have a point when his day shows up in court.
I'm not even sure that, legally the police were in there. They had approval from the court,
yeah.
But it's not against the law for a journalist to have a leaked document, even if it was stolen from somebody, as long as they weren't part of the chain of that crime, right? It seems plausible, at least according to people out there who've been observing it, that maybe the fact that he was kind of a defender of the police, for example, and that this public defender himself was very popular as a fighter for civil rights in the community, that maybe, the city officials were looking the other way. It was okay to bust down his door. Would they have done that to the reporters for the television station that aired his piece, or the San Francisco Chronicle? I doubt very seriously they would have done that.
No, I agree with that. I mean, to me, the other issue here is that the fact that it actually happened in San Francisco. This is not something that you would expect to happen.
You would expect this in a small town, looking to cover something, like your stereotypical, almost like in the heat of the night type of a situation, not in one of the largest, most liberal cities that has long since defended freedom of speech and expression.
Right, and I think Mike brings up a good point. Had it been one of the established media outlets that the police were trying to get this information, it would have happened a lot different. I mean, it would have been, hey, let's sit around a table and talk this out. Let's figure out, come to some sort of compromise. They wouldn't have stormed into one of the top television stations and said, hand over all your tape.
This was an act of intimidation. Yeah. So here's another case of police overreach. This one's in the United Kingdom. Local police in the city of Cleveland have been disciplined for abuse of spying powers. In this case, police officers were intercepting cell phone communications.
Yeah, and the laws, of course, in Great Britain are different than they are here. But there are laws that allow the police to tap into cellular communications if they are investigating a serious crime. What it appears that these journalists were looking into was misconduct on the part of the police department, including potentially racial discrimination against a former member of the police force. Does that rise to the level where you can do that kind of surveillance? And now in Great Britain, as opposed to when this case was filed, there's actually a law that says you got to get a court order before you can do that. Of course, we just saw in San Francisco, you can get a court order to do a lot of things. Right.
And that's the key. Can you get a court order? I mean, to me, this is another one of those instances where you're right, the laws are different, but, you have tremendous CCTV coverage all over Great Britain. And there's been conversations around the police use of that and how that seems to be infringing upon the right to privacy. Now the whole facial recognition is becoming an issue. So, I mean, this is one of those things where when people are starting to push back on police and law enforcement using various technologies to infringe upon what they believe is their privacy.
While we're on the topic of free speech and privacy, I want to ask you about a decision from the White House not to back something called the Christchurch Call. It's a move to censor extremist content posted to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube in response to what happened in New Zealand a few weeks ago. So let's run this through for our audience. Who is involved in this Christchurch Call? It's pretty much an international community.
There was obviously the Prime Minister of New Zealand, where the mosque shootings occurred. There was the President of France. There were a lot of other world leaders involved, as well as all the big tech companies. And what they agreed to was, basically voluntary, but they agreed on a lot of different ways to try to crack down on the use of social media to incite terror. And nobody would disagree with that motive, right? But strangely enough, I would say perhaps for the wrong reasons, the White House may have done the right thing in saying that, wait a minute, let's not be too quick to endorse the government getting involved with private companies to decide what is considered terroristic speech and what isn't. I know it's a problem, but I'm not sure that's the solution. The White House probably didn't come down on it because they're great defenders of freedom of speech in the press, but maybe despite that, they did something that might have been right. I don't know.
I mean, I think you have a point in this instance, but I do think that it is incumbent upon the companies that control right. You're talking about Facebook, you're talking about Twitter, you're talking about YouTube and others. I think they do have some sort of responsibility to identify these groups and make sure that people understand here's what's really happening here with these groups, and not just push it off on someone else, and not be able to at least assist law enforcement if there is some sort of a credible threat that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I'm not saying necessarily that the people who signed the accord are wrong. I'm saying that I think that there are a lot of ideas that most people would agree with, but it's fair to raise the question, as we did last week or the week before, about whether or not the government should get involved and how far it should get involved in determining what is hate speech or incitement to terror or whatever.
That same time, though, and this is where you were saying, too, that the White House had kind of made the right decision for the wrong reasons. The White House has just unveiled its own tool, the tech bias story sharing tool, that's somewhat questionable in its own right.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like you have this, we don't want to endorse what's going on with the Christchurch initiative, but we have our own way of dealing with whether or not how we identify bias and these sorts of things. And that being controlled by this White House and this environment leaves a lot of unanswered questions, and as far as I'm concerned, much to be desired.
Okay. Well, first it was Louis Scooter Libby, then it was Dinesh D'Souza. Now, another Trump presidential pardon, this one for media mogul Conrad Black. And this one is not just controversial for a lot of journalists, it's personal. Here's how Anderson Cooper characterized it during one of his ridiculous segments.
In announcing the pardon, the White House referred to Black, who, after he was released from prison, was deported back to Canada and then banned from returning to the U.S. for 30 years, as, quote, Lord Conrad Black. You can Google how he got that title. Let's just say he ain't in the line of succession to any throne unless it's one President Trump just flushed.
So Mike's laughing at that. Anderson Cooper also said that this pardon smelled like a bunch of rotten Easter eggs, referring to the timing and the surprise. It's not surprising that journalists would be overly critical of this choice of pardon, given Conrad Black's conviction and part of trying to embezzle from the newspaper company that he owned.
Embezzled millions of dollars, he and his co-defendant, and it could have theoretically had the effect of sending the Sun-Times, the Chicago Sun-Times, one of those papers, into the spiral. Of course, a lot of other things happen, too, to affect newspapers. But, yeah, I think journalists kind of feel a little bit, have a little special feeling about Conrad Black because of all of that.
A little special feeling. None of them are good, Mike. None of them are good.
None of them are good.
Okay.
But, I mean, also, the crime was a crime that, you'd think he deserved the punishment, but should a president be able to pardon somebody? Presidents can pardon whoever they like. I mean, you remember
presidents have been criticized
Bill
for who
Clinton
they
pardoned
yes.
Mark Rich. You remember that from way back when?
Yeah.
But he waited till the end of his presidency to do it. Trump is doing it in the middle of a time when he's being investigated, and maybe the signal isn't, hey, Conrad Black, thank you for the suck-up book you wrote about me. Maybe
that one called Trump a president like no other.
Exactly. But maybe this was aimed at least as much at all those other folks out there who could do damage to him, saying, look, I can pardon anybody I want.
Well, I mean, and I think that's part of what's driving this story, along with the fact that you have journalists who don't particularly care for the person who was pardoned. But what's driving it is, he has shown a propensity to grant pardons pretty much throughout his 2+ years in office, but the people that he's pardoned and what that potentially means for future pardons is what's really where the story is. I mean, because it could be some of the people who have found themselves either on their way to prison or already in prison who may be the beneficiaries of future pardons.
Well, and in Conrad Black's case as well, he had been deported to Canada upon release from prison and barred, I think, for like dozens, I'm trying to remember the exact number of years, from re-entering the United States. That pardon could change all of it. The Wall Street Journal was among the only outlets to say that Conrad Black deserved this pardon, that Mike's making a face, that he deserved this pardon, that he had that coming, and that this is justice. Obviously, a lot of the prosecutors in the case had their own op-eds that you can see on our links blog that say exactly the opposite. Mike, you wrote down a note as we were starting this discussion, AC, should he do it?
I mean, there's a lot of folks in the media who are open to fair criticism about the way this has been reported. And at least it was the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal that was arguing that Conrad Black deserved to be pardoned. I've gotten to the point where I'm a little bit uncomfortable by the way Anderson Cooper regularly editorializes, especially as it relates to the president, and in ways that are very mean. I mean, flushing the toilet and all the. If you watch the whole video, you'll get the point. Now, Anderson,
and then he and Chris Cuomo use that as their crosstalk between shows. Equally mean.
But I mean, Anderson Cooper is talent competing against the talent over at Fox News and MSNBC, but I don't think that MSNBC is ever sending Rachel Maddow to a flood or to an Arab Spring to cover it as a journalist. Fox News is not sending Sean Hannity to do that. I think Anderson Cooper is a different animal, and he maybe has crossed the line in ways that I wouldn't want him to.
Anderson Cooper, who's also on Sunday nights appearing on 60 Minutes.
Yeah, I mean that's been happening for a while now, and it's not just Anderson Cooper, it's also Don Lemon. Both of them have been seen as journalists in one aspect and then commentators on their nightly shows. That becomes problematic in an era where you have such partisanship going on in the news media. They're going to need to, I think CNN at some point is going to need to decide, is Anderson Cooper going to be their star news journalist, or is Anderson Cooper going to be their equivalent to Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow?
There's a line. Pick which side of it you want to be on. I want to play a clip for you. Take a listen to part of this interview with Gabe Fleischer from Fox 2 in St. Louis.
I've been interested in politics really since the 2008 elections. And, just during election times when politics is all around us, and I got really interested and curious, and I've always loved to read and write. So I started sending a newsletter to my mom when I was like 9, and it's just grown and grown from there.
You sent it to your mom to start, and it's
my
now
first subscriber.
And it really is well written. You're getting some kudos for how well you're doing.
So that was 2 years ago when Gabe was just 15. Thursday, before he left for school in the St. Louis suburbs, he hit send on his Wake Up to Politics email newsletter. And he got the scoop announcing Bill de Blasio's candidacy for president. This is a great story. He basically found this because there was a Facebook event with a misspelled name, and he discovered that Bill de Blasio was going to be announcing his candidacy for president before Bill de Blasio announced it.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, and to actually be doing it from St. Louis for the mayor of New York City.
Before he went to school to take his AP English exam.
Absolutely. Before he went to school and before I mean, you're talking about, this is the heart of the news media in this country, and they all missed it and was scooped by a kid in St. Louis.
All I can say, well, I have more to say than this, but the first thing I want to say is this. If you haven't decided where you're going to college yet, come to the Missouri School of Journalism.
And
we
Gabe,
can use you.
You can double major in journalism and political science and still graduate in 4 years. We can advise you through that process.
I just think the other thing, though, I mean, he really has done a great job of writing. I looked at his most recent blog. He has some very sophisticated analysis of the impact of this announcement and on de Blasio's candidacy. I think he writes as well as an awful lot of those professionals in Washington who were scooped on the announcement.
And he's not even on the road. I mean, he's writing this based on...
He's on his way to AP English.
Well, right. But I
think he aced that test, probably.
I mean, his writing and his analysis is spot on, and he's doing it by basically being able to pull together all of these resources and logically think through and come to some conclusions that you don't see on normally from people who've been doing it for years.
And you talk about people who have been doing it for years. One of the things that, if you watch that whole interview, again, it is 2 years old, but he was saying 2 years ago, he has an upwards, at least at that time, of 30,000 subscribers to this thing. It's been referenced by CNN. It's been referenced by the New York Times. He even name dropped as one of his subscribers, a friend of our journalism school and alum, Major Garrett, who is a chief correspondent for CBS News.
I saw an update, and if I'm not mistaken, it said he has 50,000 followers now, and I don't doubt it. I mean, he's that good. And all he did was just sort of fanatically follow sources, in this case a Facebook page that had lists of all kinds of press releases and events and things, and sort of was a clearinghouse for that. And he just kept refresh, and he sees this thing from Iowa, and there you go. He got the story.
I mean,
the kid is smart.
and de Blasio was not a name that had just sort of popped up in terms of being a possible candidate. I mean, what do we have, like almost 30 now on the Democratic side, and now he's in the mix. And it just, to me, when you look at all of this, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out and who's going to get the kind of coverage that, of course, you saw in this blog, but the kind of coverage period, because there's just so many candidates right now.
Okay, so we only have about 30 seconds to talk about this one. Story that I saw in the New York Times. It looks like Whitney Houston's estate is going to consider putting her back on tour in the form of a hologram.
Hey, Maria Callas, Roy Orbison, Frank Zappa are some of the people who've done the exact same thing. They're all dead. Whitney Houston, I might be kind of inclined to want to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it goes to the fact that these estates are looking for a way to enhance that reputation, which increases the value of their name and the estate. So I think that's why this is
the catalog too, I guess.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, we're pretty much out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog. That's under both the programs and podcast tabs at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about on our next program, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Aaron Hay for handling the audio. Tim Pilcher composed our original theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll see you next time.